I'm currently completely at a loss what to do. I, 21F, have just escaped my parents after finding something horrifying in my dad's beach house. I've always loved mermaids. Yes, I was one of those kids obsessed with everything mermaid, whether that was TV shows, movies, books, any marine-related media, really, but mermaids especially. I loved everything about the sea, about water, until I almost drowned on my 5th birthday. So, with a newfound fear of even dipping my toes in the shallows, I became fascinated with fake water instead. Mum called it a mental illness. I can see where she was coming from, considering I asked for every pool or water-related game ever made, but I was just a kid. I preferred water to land, and even terrified of it, I still wanted to submerge myself in it, imagining a whole other world. I barely remember almost drowning, only the contorting fear twisting inside me and swallowing me up, the inability to speak, my voice cruelly torn away, my breath stolen as I sank further into the abyss, also known as the deep end of our neighbour's pool. Mum said I didn't realise it was that deep, since I was used to our own pool. There I was, sitting on the edge with my legs swinging and a plate of birthday cake in my hands, when I had the bright idea to show the adults how cute I was. This is my mum's retelling, so it's probably exaggerated, but apparently I dropped headfirst into the pool, cake and all, and sank straight to the bottom. Dad dove in after me, pulling me back to the surface, dragging me from the shallows. But it was too late. I was screaming, hysterical, backing away from the pool like it was filled with lava. The crazy thing is, I remember this exact feeling. I remember staggering back, the ice-cold breeze tickling my cheeks, feeling wrong compared to the warmth of the water that was supposed to protect me. The ice-cold concrete of my neighbour's patio felt wrong. Land felt wrong. The water that had almost killed me felt right, and I could never understand why. Instead of caressing me, this cruel underwater world had dragged me down, 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 squeezing my lungs and stealing my air, crushing instead of cradling me. I avoided water and didn't go near any pool after that, even ours, the very one I used to spend every spare hour splashing around in. When Mum tried to bathe me, I insisted on the water being ankle deep, with her using a cup to rinse my hair as I tilted my head back, squeezing my eyes shut. According to Mum, I would scream until my throat was raw if there was too much water. Even washing my hands and brushing my teeth, I remember timing the flow just right, so I could stick my toothbrush or soapy hands under, count 3 elephants, and then dive out of the bathroom. I flooded the floors on multiple occasions when I forgot to turn off the faucet. But still, somehow I was fascinated with water itself. I loved how it was still, how it ran and trickled and filled my cupped hands. According to Mum, I told my therapist I wanted to be a fish. However, my therapist had a sort of resolution. She leaned forward and grabbed my hands, squeezing them tight. "Okay, Sadie, well, if you're scared of real water, why don't you try fake water?" Which, I guess, is how my mermaid obsession started. My therapist started me with little kids' games about solving puzzles underwater, and immediately I was hooked. Through my fascination with digital water, I found mermaids, beautiful human-like fish people who could breathe underwater, living in vast, towering cities deep, deep under the sea. I watched every Little Mermaid, binging mermaid-themed movies and TV shows. By the age of 9, I was fully convinced I was actually a mermaid, and touching water would magically transform my legs into a tail. It didn't, obviously, so I did what any supposedly mentally ill 9-year-old would do. I swallowed 2 teaspoons of salt mixed with tears of terror before sticking my head underwater for 10 seconds. Again, nothing happened. But I was starting to slowly overcome my fear of being submerged in water, so I lowered myself onto the stairs in the shallow end of our pool and forced myself to get used to it. I was still acclimating when my brother shoved my head under, quickly reminding me of that sensation, the squeezing of my chest, the inability to breathe, choking on bubbles exploding around me. After that, Dad insisted on teaching me how to swim. Like me, he'd always been fascinated with water, so he refused to have a child who couldn't swim. Before my older brother and I were even born, he enrolled us in lessons. Harvey was 5 years older than me, so he could already swim. Dad wanted to take me to the sea, though I was more comfortable in the pool. However, my swimming classes were short-lived. I barely learned how to keep my head afloat, when Dad left in the middle of the night and never came back. But neither did my brother. I woke up around midnight to Mum hysterically crying. I discovered the next morning that Dad had taken my brother Hooker diving without proper equipment, and Harvey was in the emergency room. Initially, I was told my brother was very sick, which obviously I believed. I was playing Sonic with my brother only yesterday. In my head, he was just sick in the hospital. I spent the day expecting him to drag himself into my bedroom at any time, knock something over, call me a name, and run away. But the house was empty. Mum didn't come out of her room, not even to take me to school. Instead, I watched Cartoon Network all day. I poked my head in my brother's room, and it was a noticeable mess, clothes strewn everywhere in a half-packed suitcase. When I asked to see Harvey a few days later, Mum told me he was dead. Brain dead, at least. She explained it the best she could, choking on her own words. Harvey had gone too deep, and when trying to resurface, his blood had bubbles and his brain had popped. I don't think she was mentally okay enough to explain to her 9-year-old daughter that her brother was dead. Yeah, no, considering she used our soda stream and a grape to demonstrate the accident with a hysterical smile on her mouth, almost like she thought it was funny. I didn't find it funny. Watching the bubbles in the water and my mother pop a grape between her index and thumb with a huge grin on her face was actually fucking traumatizing. I know people grieve in their own way. Even as a kid, though, I was confused when my brother didn't get a funeral. Dad did come back, but only to try and justify his trip with Harvey. He said it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and that he was just doing what was best for his kids. I already despised him for taking my brother away, but the way he talked about him, insisting that Harvey loves the water, made me want to scream. He was wrong. While I was obsessed with water, my brother had steered away from it, especially the sea. Mum called him a psycho and threw him out. Dad moved to the other side of town, and it was just Mum and me once again. For a long time, I hated my father. I ignored his letters, calls, texts, and the mermaid figurines he sent me for my birthday. I didn't understand grieving, and worse, post-grieving. Did such a thing exist? I understood that I was sad, and sometimes I was happy, before feeling guilty for catching myself smiling. I missed him, so I got a diary. I wrote to my brother, telling him everything and nothing, sometimes just what I did that day, or telling him how Mum was. I started attending group therapy. One girl said she forgave her father for killing her mother in a car crash, but her words became entangled in my mind, frustrating me, bleeding into confusion and anger I couldn't control. How could she forgive something like that? I asked her after, and she shrugged and said, "It wasn't his fault." "But it was my dad's fault," I told her, leaning forward in my chair. "He killed my brother." The girl, Mia, I think her name was, I could never read her name tag, it was either Mia or Mira, folded her arms, shooting me a glare. "Well, maybe you should forgive him." When I asked Mum in the car on the way home, she said the exact same thing. "It was an accident, Sadie," Mum said. "Your father took your brother diving and he wasn't ready." She averted her gaze, her hands tightening around the wheel. Harvey asked him to take him out during a storm. Something ice cold trickled down my spine. "But you said—" She said Harvey didn't want to go diving. There wasn't a storm that night. I would have heard it. She said my brother hated the ocean and he wanted no part of it. Mum's eyes darkened and she opened her mouth like she was going to speak before changing the subject, flicking on the radio. "Do you want to get takeout tonight?" I wanted to question her, but I didn't even know what to ask. But then I was questioning my own memories. Did Mum say what I remembered, or did I mishear her? It took me a long time to realize maybe Harvey's death wasn't Dad's fault after all. After a while of therapy and listening to other kids' stories, I started to wonder if hating him was the right thing to do. Mum was talking to him civilly, at least. The two of them met for coffee every Saturday, and Mum seemed like she had genuinely forgiven him. The other kids asked me if my mum was over Harvey's death, but I guess laughing was inappropriate. Grieving is an individual emotion, Mr. Prescott, our therapist kept saying when I was on my knees giggling into the prickly carpet. Was my mother over my brother's death? Yes, of course she was. That's what I told my friends, who I made sure stayed far away from our house. Mum was fine, I told everyone. She was completely fine, and definitely not slowly losing her mind, insisting on buying a giant aquarium for her room and named her new pet flounder fish Harvey. Mum isn't crazy, I told myself, which became my mantra. She just had her own way of grieving. Besides, I did like Harvey. He was pretty cool for a fish. always waiting for me behind the glass when I got home from school. Mom isn't crazy. That's what I told myself again when I caught her opening the tank and trying to fish Harvey out of the water to hold him. Unlike other fish, though, he didn't freak out or squirm, instead staying cupped in her hands. So no, I finally admitted to my therapy class, bursting into tears. Mum definitely wasn't over my brother. I was 11 years old, and my mother was on the brink of a breakdown. She worked all day, every day, and on weekends all she talked about was either work or Harvey the fish, often pausing so he could join in conversations. Sometimes she asked him, "How's school?" I had to quietly remind her that the fish wasn't actually my brother. I needed someone normal. I found normal in the family pool, enveloping myself in my comfort zone. Over the years, I taught myself how to swim, envisioning my tail again. In my mind, I could swim away from my family and never go back. Unfortunately, I was old enough to know mermaids weren't real. The only connection I did have with the ocean was with Harvey. Dad called every day inviting me to visit. I always declined. I wasn't interested in his shiny new life. Dad was an architect and had designed his own house by the sea. I ignored him until my 12th birthday, when he sent a text which just said, "Happy birthday, pumpkin. I have a surprise for you, but you're going to have to come see it yourself. Our door is always open, Sadie. You're going to love them." I wasn't exactly ecstatic. Dad's new girlfriend, who was half his age, smelled like red tide when she came to visit, and I wasn't looking forward to the awkward conversation I would be having with my father. If I'm honest, though, part of me was intrigued by the photos Mum showed me. So, ignoring my therapist, who said, "Just give it a little more time," I rode my bike to his beach house after school. Dad's place teetered on the sea, designed to blend with the ocean itself. On the edge of a cliff with grandiose pillars, which were way too much, lay my father's house, cut off from the rest of the town, and definitely showing off his wealth. I wasn't expecting it to be so modern. French doors leading me inside sported betta fish carvings, an axolotl in a 50-gallon tank greeting me with its trademark smile. I was hesitant at first. If I fully walked inside, I wouldn't be able to leave without having a painful conversation with my father. But running away seemed childish, even for a soon-to-be 12-year-old. I admit I was impressed. If these were the lengths he'd gone to get my attention, well, he had me hook, line, and sinker. Dad had designed his house to resemble an aquarium. The hallway was illuminated with a soft blue light, every wall a different tank filled with a variety of fish. It was almost like being in real-life Animal Crossing. Farther down, glass floors mimicked the deep ocean, filled with tiny flounder swimming below. I've always been afraid of heights, so stepping on flooring resembling the deep ocean twisted my gut and yet filled me with exhilaration, like stepping across an underwater world. It was both beautiful and way over the top. But that was Dad's MO. We always had to have the best pool when I was a kid. "Sadie," Dad's voice startled me when I was staring, transfixed by everything around me. I didn't know what to look at first. Everything was water-themed. Even the stairs. It was pretty, sure, but it didn't look lived in. The walls were filled with fish, a beautiful display of marine life showcased on every corner. I found myself pressed up against schools of Nemo fish, spiraling in scarlet streams, stealing away my breath, beautiful. But there was nothing that made this house a home stained coffee cups and magazines strewn all over the floor. That was Mum's house. Dad's was more like a museum. I was intrigued by the kitchen lit up in a bioluminescent glow, slowly inching towards it, when Dad's voice came again, this time from underneath me. "I'm in the basement, sweetie." I had half a mind to run. It hit me that I didn't want to see my father. I just wanted to see my surprise. The teenage brain is selfish, but I had my reasons. Still, though, I found myself drawn to the basement, my sneakers making smacking noises down the steps. Unlike upstairs, the lower levels of Dad's house were yet to be renovated. Thinking of the Death Star, there was no stair rail. My hands grazed cold brick walls before darkness became ocean blue, like walking on the seafloor. The low hum of a filtration system cut through the silence, my steps quickening. The basement was not what I was expecting, a simple room with one singular tank. The stink of seawater and bleach drowned my nose and throat, both clinical and otherworldly, forcing my legs further. Dad stood in front, grinning beneath a banner saying, "Happy 12th birthday." I was already taking steps forward, my body in control of my mind. The tank was darker than the others, tiny green lights at the bottom illuminating clear water. I could barely register Dad's words, my gaze glued to the glass. His voice sounded like ocean waves crashing against the shore, wading in and out of my ears. "I asked my friends for a favor," he said. "They specialize in marine research and, well, during their last expedition, they found something incredible, Sadie." Dad's grin was contagious, and in 3 strides, I was pressing my face against the glass. I don't know what I was expecting. Was it a new species of fish? "They're shy," Dad hummed. "Just stay there and they'll come over to you." I found my voice strangled in my throat, my skin prickling with goosebumps. "They?" Something warm expanded in my chest when a face appeared behind the glass. A beautiful girl with long dark hair haloing around her, tiny points on her ears and strange rugged skin, but it wasn't her face I was mesmerized by. Yes, she was hypnotizing. Every part of her seemed to glow, wide green eyes and a glittering smile. I staggered back, a cry clawing at my throat, when I realized she didn't have legs. Instead, a long blue tail was molded to her torso, each scale intricate and sparkling. The skin below her breast was rugged, slits carved into her flesh. Gills. This couldn't be happening, I thought dizzily. I was staring at a real-life mermaid. She was so pretty, graceful, gently tapping on the glass, playing an invisible piano with her fingers. I was joining in, laughing when the mermaid pressed her fingertips against mine, when movement came behind her, a shadow looming into view. It was a boy this time, dark brown hair billowing around him adorned with seaweed, a green tail in place of legs. There was a noticeable scar on his throat. It made me wonder if a fish had attacked him. The merman was different. Unlike his female companion, he wasn't smiling, instead folding his arms and refusing to meet my gaze. When he accidentally made eye contact, he turned and flicked his tail in my face, hiding behind the girl. Dad laughed. "The male is quite standoffish. Don't worry, he's like that with everybody. He wasn't easy to catch." I could barely speak, staring at the girl, who waved, her smile broadening. "Uh-huh," I managed to choke out. I didn't notice my father wrapping his arms around me. His touch felt foreign and wrong, but also comforting. I hadn't hugged him in so long. I found myself missing him, and the conversation I wanted to have, all of those poisonous words in my throat, contorted into childish squeals of joy. "They're yours, Sadie," Dad murmured into my hair. "I have a deal where I can keep them here for observation, but they're officially yours." "Mermaids," I said. Dad nodded. "Well, the scientific name for them is HAB, or human-like aquatic beings, but yes," he chuckled, "they are mermaids." Dad paused, striding over to the tank. I noticed the male mermaid flinch, almost immediately swimming over to the glass, tapping his fingers against the pane. I joined him, raising my fingers while watching his dark brown curls fly around him, bubbles escaping his mouth when he parted his lips in what I think was a greeting. The points in his ears reminded me of Faye, and I couldn't stop smiling. He looked so human, and yet these tiny details, like his ears and narrow features, told me he belonged in the ocean. I had dreamed of being able to breathe underwater, and this boy was doing just that, staring at me with coffee brown eyes. When his head inclined slowly, I couldn't resist a giggle. I figured I looked pretty alien to him. Dad nudged me playfully. "We haven't figured out their language yet. We know it's quite similar to whales or even dolphins. It's rare when they do speak, but it's beautiful, Sadie." Dad's eyes were wide. "It's almost like they're singing the melody of their world, the songs of their people." I prodded the glass and the merman copied, his lips curling into a scowl. The female mermaid swam over, shoving him out of the way. She seemed more excited, following my fingers excitedly. "What do you think you're going to call them?" Dad hummed. I turned to him. "They don't have names." He shrugged, and then Dad's expression was my father again, his eyes growing sad, like he remembered why I was here, and just like me, Dad didn't want to talk about my brother. Turning to face the mermaids, his smile faded. "They were originally named Specimen 1 and 2, but I don't think those names suit them." I met the girl's eyes, and like a child, her smile broke out into a grin. While she was wide-eyed and smiley, the male mermaid folded his arms, carefully tracking me with his gaze, lip curled, like he could sense me thinking up names. I traced the glass, the seaweed entangled in the boy's hair almost resembling a crown. I half wondered giddily if the male was a prince. "Falan," I said without thinking, and to my shock he rolled his eyes. Dad cleared his throat. The male seems to have remarkably similar characteristics to a human male, he said. His paperwork suggests he copies human expressions. I moved on to the girl, who was playful, tapping her fingers against the glass. Ira. The girl nodded excitedly, copying my smile. Dad was hesitant this time to touch me, instead clapping me on the shoulder. I think she likes her name, he said, heading to the door. Elle is making pasta if you want to join us. No pressure, sweetie. Dad left me with the mermaids, and admittedly the first thing I did was jump up and down like a 12-year-old. I ate dinner with Dad and his girlfriend that night, and I waited to have the talk, but it never came. In fact, when I visited the following weekend, everything I wanted to tell him was suffocated by the beings in his basement. I spent hours with the two of them, talking to Ira about everything from school to my worries about my mother. She would nod and try to listen, her eyes wide like she could understand me. I figured that wasn't the case when I lied and told her an asteroid was going to destroy the planet, and she nodded excitedly, lips spreading into a grin. Sometimes she copied me. When I laughed, she did too, or she tried to. I don't think it was easy for her under the water. I started missing therapy sessions to spend time with the mermaids, but it was only Ira who engaged with me, always waiting for me when I arrived, sometimes asleep, curled up at the bottom of the tank. Falan, meanwhile, completely ignored me, instead spending all of his time either scowling at me or closer to the surface. I caught him trying to swim up several times, only to dive back down, returning to his little spot to continue brooding. As I got older, I expected the mermaids to age too, but instead, they seemed to be physically frozen around what looked like the ages of early 20s, judging from their looks. I turned 13, and I spent every summer and weekend with them. Dad told me to entertain them, try and get them used to human activities, so I introduced them to my phone, pressing it to the glass. While Ira seemed impressed by literally everything, Falan did his signature eye roll, as if saying, "Oh, wow, it's a weird device with a light. I've already seen one." Dad did say the male mermaid was talented at mimicking human expression, so I figured Falan had seen a phone. So, in my quest to impress this stubborn merboy, I showed him a TV, and then my Nintendo 3DS. He didn't seem interested in the TV, but his eyes lit up when I showed him Pokemon. I think it was the bright colors, but his eyes seemed glued to the screen, following my little character. I made an unspoken pact with him. I showed him Pokemon, playing it with him every time I visited, and he stopped with the scowling and the rolling of the eyes. Falan didn't stop being an asshole, but every time I stepped into the basement, it was him who was waiting, eagerly, his face pressed against the glass. When he saw me, the merman leaned back, pretending he wasn't waiting for me. I showed him a new game, Zelda, and he surprised me with the smallest of smiles, his eyes glued to my screen. Ira sometimes joined us, but she grew bored easily, either falling asleep or swimming up to the surface. After introducing him to video games, Falan was a lot more animated. I was 14 when I dragged myself once again to Dad's beach house. It was my first year of junior high, and I had nobody to talk to about the mermaids. When I visited them, Falan was on the surface, leaning against the side, his head comfortably nestled in his arms. I noticed the tank was open, so it must have been feeding time. Every day around 5 p.m, Dad opened up the tank, dropping in what looked like mutilated fish guts and little flakes. Falan always ignored the food, while Ira immediately dove for fleshy entrails, stuffing them into her mouth. Falan needed a little coaxing, so Dad thrust a long metal pole into the water, gently nudging the merman towards the food. That day there was no sign of my father, and both mermaids were on the surface. Falan with his head in his arms, and Ira looking lost, her eyes wide. It was the first time I had seen her without her excited little grin. Falan must have sensed me, since his head jerked up when I dropped my backpack on the floor. This was the first time I'd seen him fully on the surface, but when he locked eyes with me, I realized he was panting, struggling to breathe, his fingers gingerly prodding at his throat. The air must have been hurting him, I thought. He wasn't used to our air, so why was he so insistent on staying on the surface? Stupid boy. I made my way over to the tank, and to my surprise he swam over, sticking his head over the side. Falan made a choking sound, and I understood he was trying and failing to mimic our language. He tried again, his eyes strained, lips parting, but no words came out, only strange guttural noises I could almost mistake for words. This happened twice. The second time the tank was half shut, but Falan broke the surface when he saw me come in, parted his lips, and tried to speak, seemingly frustrated with his inability to mimic human speech. He tried again, and this time Elle could see he was visibly struggling to stay on the surface. Ira, to my confusion, pulled him back under the water, and to me, pointed upwards. I did my best to communicate with her, just like Dad told me. I had to speak with my hands instead of my mouth. "You want me to open the tank?" I said, motioning upwards. "Sadie." Dad joined me, carrying a bucket full of entrails. He dumped the food in the tank and shut the lid all the way, flashing me a smile. "I know they're pretty to look at, but they're also dangerous." He nodded to Fallon, who ignored the food, instead pressed against the glass, glaring at my father. "These beings are carnivores, sweetie. I don't mean to scare you, but I don't think swimming with them would be a whole lot of fun." I found myself nodding, watching sharp red dilute the depths, Ira snatching up tangled fish intestine. I watched her eat it, sharp incisors biting through a cloud of red, obscuring my vision and spreading around her. The smile on her face no longer looked playful. She looked happy to be eating, and something ice-cold trickled down my spine when her eyes met mine, this time not with curiosity but something else entirely, something I was in denial of. After that day, I guess I started to grow up. The mermaids in my dad's basement were beautiful, yes, but all signs pointed to them also trying to lure me into their tank. Dad didn't say they will eat you, but he did supervise my visits from then on, making sure I kept my distance. The two of them didn't change, but my childhood fantasy of friendly fish people darkened to a more plausible reality. Fallon and Ira were not my friends, nor were they my presents. I was the naive prey who was almost fish food. I stopped visiting after Fallon started gesturing me inside their tank. I wanted nothing to do with them. Growing up, I still saw them during holidays. But the basement was filling up with other things, my dad's belongings and my toys from childhood. I saw them once before college, the two of them slamming themselves against the tank when I walked in. I couldn't tell if they were excited or hungry. Ira's eyes were almost sad, her lips parting as if to say, "You left us." Fallon tapped the glass, cocking his head. I noticed his scar was bigger. Maybe Dad accidentally caught it when he was coaxing the merman to his food. I think Fallon knew it was a goodbye. He didn't understand the concept of college, and I wasn't going to try to explain it to him. I left them like that and never went back. Over these years, I wondered if Dad had released them back into the sea. Ever since I left home at 18, I've been flying to and from college every couple of months, due to a respiratory condition that came out of nowhere. I thought it was the mold in my college dorms, but when I moved to another room, I still found myself waking up, choking on air, like my lungs refused to work. Numerous scans informed me I'm completely healthy, and all the doctor can give me is an inhaler. I was supposed to meet with a specialist in town anyway, so I figured I would pay Dad a visit. I headed back to Dad's beach house with the excuse to pick up some old trinkets I left behind. There was no sign of him, so I let myself in, making my way down to the basement. Dad had changed the lighting to a duller blue, and immediately I was comforted with the familiar stink of salt water and strong bleach that smelled right. The stairs were wet, I noticed, slowly making my way down to the basement. The tank was still there, illuminated in dazzling blue, but it was bigger. I saw Ira before she saw me, and I noticed a change in her. She wasn't smiling. Instead, the mermaid's eyes were alert, her fingers tapping against the glass. "Hey," I greeted her, a cough I couldn't control taking over. Ira jumped, startled, when I knocked on the glass. Her gaze found mine, and something twisted in my gut. Her expression was wild, contorted, and not what I remembered. When she pointed upwards for me to open the tank, I shook my head, biting back the urge to say, "Nice try." I could tell she hadn't eaten yet. The tank was fresh, so my dad was yet to feed them. "Where's Fallon?" I asked, remembering how to talk with my expression. Ira didn't respond. With a stoic face, she pointed upwards again. The absurdity of me talking to my childhood mermaid friend sent me into fits of laughter, which became a coughing fit. When I spluttered out a cough, her eyes widened, and I swore her gaze flicked to my torso. With the mermaid mostly ignoring me, I went in search of my trinkets I left behind in one of the towering boxes filling the basement. I was looking for my music box, and an old mermaid figurine Harvey had given me for my 5th birthday. I found myself going through memory lane, diving into boxes of old toys and my endless collection of mermaid memorabilia. Shoving aside holiday decorations, I stuck my hands in another box, pulling out a folded yellow dress. The dress was cute, but I didn't remember wearing it. I thought maybe it was Elle's, but it was way too small. Ella was a curvy woman. Throwing the dress aside, I pulled out cargo shorts this time, followed by a short-sleeved band shirt and a Lakers cap covered in dust. With the clothes in my hands, I had a sudden hysterical thought that these were my brother's clothes. But he was dead. He died when I was 9 years old. I could feel my hands starting to tremble, digging deeper into the box. This time, a backpack with a tiny Pikachu attached to the zipper. I went through it, pulling out workbooks and crumbled schedules, a bottle of water and a crumbling sandwich covered in mold. Opening the workbooks, I flicked through pages and pages of intricate handwriting. A stress toy was at the very bottom of the pack, collecting dust. I could sense my breathing starting to accelerate when my hands grasped a bright green handbag filled with makeup, a dead phone, and a laptop. But it was right at the bottom of the box where I found the nail in the coffin that sent bile shooting up my throat. 2 college IDs. The first, neat and looked after, on a red string, belonged to a scowling 22-year-old English major, Matthew Whittam. The second ID tag, covered in scribbles and doodles, was 23-year-old Quinn Cartwright, a smiling brunette who, according to her tag, was a film student. The tag slipped out of my hands and I puked, heaving up my mediocre dinner. Ira and Falan. The beings in the tank were not mermaids, they were human. Before I could stop myself, I grabbed the clothes again, the yellow dead with noticeable smears of red on the collar, and the cargo shorts torn and blooded when I turned them inside out. I don't even remember standing up. With the ID tag in my hands, I stumbled over to the tank, pressing Ira's identity against the glass. But she didn't even recognize herself, slowly cocking her head to the side. This hurt, a pang in my chest physically squeezing my lungs. This time I opened the tank, and the girl broke the surface. She didn't speak because she couldn't, instead flailing her arms. I thought back to the scar on Falan's throat, and I felt sick to my stomach. Instead of speaking, Ira pointed to the door, her eyes wide and desperate. "It's okay," I told her calmly. "Where's Falan?" When her eyes narrowed to slits, I caught myself. "Matthew," I corrected quickly. "Where is Matthew?" Before she could respond, my father's voice sounded from upstairs, followed by what sounded like muffled screaming. Ira's head snapped to me when the muffled screaming grew closer, my father's footsteps following. I could hear the sound of something wet hitting concrete like a tail. Ira pointed towards a box, and I understood, diving behind the door. The wet slapping noises continued, all the way down the stairs, before my father appeared, a bloody apron over jeans and a shirt, dragging along a figure. It was another guy, lying on his stomach, blood spilling from his lips and nose, streaking down his bare torso. I had to slap my hand over my mouth. I could still see the guy's legs, or what used to be his legs, twisted into something resembling a tail. His ears still looked human, the sharp points almost looked man-made. Dad dragged the boy across the floor, panting. "It's okay," he told the boy who was half-human. The guy was struggling to breathe, like a fish out of water. Once your lungs have gotten used to the water, you'll adapt. When he yanked the boy by his grotesque legs, slowly morphing into a tail, the boy coughed up something that dripped down his chin. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his arms dead weights by his side. Dad carried the boy, bridal style, up a ladder to the surface. I thought he was going to throw him in, but instead, my father pulled out a knife. "It's okay," he kept telling the guy in sharp breaths. "I know it hurts, but you won't be able to adapt if I don't do this." I could see Ira watching, her hand over her mouth, as my father dragged the blade across the boy's throat, slicing it open and dumping him into the water. The boy sank, his body bent in an arch, sharp red blooming around him. He was dead. His tail was limp, his arms dragging him down. Ira caught the boy, cradling him in her arms. Dad watched, a smile pricking on his lips. The merman jolted in Ira's arms, his eyes shooting open, and when he breathed by habit, clutching his chest, a stream of bubbles flying from his mouth. When the nameless boy caught hold of himself, he pounded his fists against the glass, lips parting in a silent cry. Dad ignored him, dumping fish guts into the water and forcing him to eat them. It struck me why Fallon and Ira were only alert when they didn't eat. My father was drugging their food, keeping them docile. He had cut their voices directly from their throat, carved into their bodies, cruelly molding them into my stupid fucking childhood fantasy. When my dad left them, Ira tried to tell me to stay to help her calm down the new merman, who kept pounding his fists against the glass. But I think part of her wanted me to hunt down her companion. I knew from the panicked glances she kept sending me that she was worried for him. Dad said his office was out of bounds when I was a kid, and I never thought much of it. When I pushed through the door, which was surprisingly unlocked, I realized why. All around me, bathed in clinical white light, were towering tanks filled with both human and fish parts, floating torsos and severed heads, victims no longer with identities. Dad was studying how to combine the two. His notes were strewn everywhere, screwed up and thrown in an overflowing trash can and stuck to the wall. I found Fallon pinned to a surgical table, a tube stuck down his throat. The human boy cruelly twisted into something inhuman, and yet my father was sadistic enough to continue the facade, leaving the seaweed entwined in his curls like he was a circus act. There was a sensor above him, every movement he made setting off a sprinkler, soaking him. It was when he didn't move, which glued me to the spot. When his tail dried up, I panicked, reaching to wave my arm in front of the sensor. Instead, however, to my shock, his tail started to change, contorting and morphing into something that resembled legs, but were more grotesque, cruelly stitched to his torso in a horrific attempt to change from a mermaid into a human boy. When the sensor activated, soaking him again, Fallon's body jerked, and he choked up splattered red, splashing the tube. His eyes flickered open, and he opened his mouth to speak. But his words were gibberish, his voice an incomprehensible hiss. I remembered how to move. Police! That was my first thought. I needed to get the cops. I tried to leave, stumbling over to the door, but something caught my eye. Another tank, and floating inside it, an all too familiar face. But he wasn't supposed to be so limp, so wrong. Unmoving. Harvey's body had long since decomposed, and yet pieces of flesh still remained, still my big brother. And yet his body wasn't, cruelly ripped apart and stitched together, a mutilated fishtail attached to his torso. His skin was covered in mismatched scales, like a virus taking over, shredding him apart, only leaving a slimy, green-tinged substance coating him. Harvey was dead, but the thing stitched to him, entangling decomposing flesh, was still alive. I got out of there, and then the house in 4 single breaths. I ran home. I woke up yesterday unable to breathe, this time choking up blood. Mum wasn't there. When I stepped into the shower, I pieced together my thoughts and what exactly I was going to tell the cops, without sounding crazy. But when my fingers grazed the skin of my torso, just below my breast, I could feel 3 singular gashes in my skin. Feeling the other side, there they were, splitting my flesh apart, warm to the touch, and yet somehow feeling natural. I can't believe I'm saying this, but being in water feels better. I can finally breathe. But I find myself stumbling when I'm trying to walk, and I'm terrified. I keep getting out of breath and my skin feels too dry, like it's sucked of moisture. I tried to get into the basement earlier, and unsurprisingly, it's locked. There's no sign of Mum or Dad. There's no sign of Mum or Dad. The only thing I have right now is Mum's stupid pet fish. I feel like I'm suffocating on air. You have to help me. Please help me save the people trapped in my father's basement. The second worst mistake was arriving. The worst mistake was leaving. There's a certain arrogance to human exploration, driving the flag into the dirt first, as if that means a damn thing. Of course, I'm not entirely cynical. Charting the world is about more than greed and glory. It's about overcoming that ancient fear of the unknown, mapping every plot of land so there are no more hidden crevices to keep us up at night. Nonetheless, our endeavors are selfish, and we have, for many centuries, blindly considered ourselves superior. When discovering new land, we've never considered a haunting possibility, that something other than man may have already staked a claim. Temper your expectations, Dr. Crenshaw, our expedition leader, warned loudly as we scaled the cliff face of a 1,000-meter tall mountain. I grunted whilst finding handholds and footholds in unreliable nooks. We were ascending no ordinary mountain. The rock-formed skyscraper jutted from the dirt like a square, or perhaps a squircle, poking out of a sorting cube's hole. It was a flat-topped mound, rising almost unnaturally out of the ground-level forest. A misshapen mountain sprouting bushy trees, like hairs from its level head. That old-growth rainforest we hoped would be untouched. We wanted to discover it before anyone else. It was an Inselberg, meaning island mountain. Such natural formations, which tower above flat land, are difficult to climb, on account of their near-vertical sides. That was why we doubted any early humans would have managed to reach the top of the berg. We were ecstatic to be the first explorers to tread on that sky-high soil. An undiscovered piece of land is a rarity in the 21st century. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the mountaintop. Crenshaw was the first to disappear over the sharp edge. He crawled onto the grass, unclipped his carabiner, and gasped loudly, prompting Howard Williams, Rachel Garcia, and me to speed up a little, as we were eager to experience that momentous event for ourselves. I was the second to cross the threshold and see the rainforest in reality, rather than a photograph. I pushed up from the grass with my palms, and my jaw fell as I stood, as I witnessed the splendor of the wooded ocean ahead, a canopy of leaves nearly entirely blocking out all sunlight, creating a sense of calm in the forest, a sense of peace that we were about to disturb. This was a team of biologists and researchers who had spent years following in the footsteps of others. We did not stop to think. We were all enchanted by the possibility of doing something original, the possibility of making history. "What do you think, Steph?" Howard asked, collecting our climbing equipment. "It's pretty," I said, brushing mud and debris off my clothes. He rolled his eyes. "I was hoping for something a little more, scientific. And I was hoping for more than 30 seconds to conduct my research, Howard," I teased. He chuckled and replied, "That's fair." "I'm eager to see this cave," Rachel said. Dr. Crenshaw pointed ahead. "Well, if we push ahead, we'll be in and out long before nightfall." "You seem confident," Howard said. "Do you need a moment to get your bearings?" "Not at all, Williams. I've been studying the aerial mappings religiously for the past month," Dr. Crenshaw said, "to the detriment of my health, I must admit." Yes. It was a little disconcerting to have a yawning man climbing directly above me, I pointed out. "But after watching you work for so many weeks, I don't doubt that you would be able to sleepwalk your way to this cave entrance." Our leader laughed, letting a glimpse of emotion loose. "I won't argue with that, Smithson. Come on, let's get moving." Crenshaw was such a tightly wound man. I was relieved to see him letting his muscles loosen, letting himself enjoy something. He rarely looked joyous. His hunger to climb this Inselberg in Mozambique was driven by necessity, not desire. It was an itch he simply had to scratch, no matter how apprehensive he felt. He wasn't a cold man. In fact, I'd always viewed him a little as a father figure, stoic and silent, but layered. I wanted to help our leader, wanted to ease some of his anxiety about the excursion. That was why I rushed through the tall mopane trees of the forest, which formed a sun-obstructing canopy overhead, rushed to catch up to Crenshaw. The man was twice my age but barely broke a sweat. His pace was hard to match, so I settled for tagging along just behind him. "This is a historical moment," I breathlessly said. Crenshaw grunted. If, I repeated between heavy pants. "If we haven't been beaten," he finished. I shook my head. "We haven't been beaten. I'm sure of it. We were the first to locate this forest with the aerial." "I'm not talking about recorded history," Dr. Crenshaw interrupted. "At some point long ago, man may well have walked here." "How?" I asked. "The sides are so steep, so difficult to climb even with modern gear." "Sometimes," the man began, slowing his stride, "things are difficult to see, Smithson." And then he stopped, causing me to almost bump into his back. "Careful, Steph," Rachel said, almost colliding with me. "What's the hold-up, slowpoke?" "We found it," Dr. Crenshaw whispered. The leader stepped aside, allowing the rest of the team to see what he had found. There was a hole in the dirt, the entrance to the cave, to a pocket within the mountain. "I'll unload the gear," Howard said, starting to unzip his rucksack. "No need," Crenshaw replied, pointing his torch into the chasm. "Look." The four of us crept towards the edge of the cave entrance below our feet, and we followed the bright beam. It illuminated a walkway protruding from cave's inner surface, a slope of rock hugging the wall and spiraling downwards. Not a single member of the team spoke for the next 30 seconds. Our gazes traced every surface revealed by the beam. I did not know for certain, but I presumed the sloping walkway continued right to the bottom, as the torch did not illuminate the cave's floor 100 feet below. Eventually, we all accepted the hole's inescapable purpose. "A stairwell," Rachel whispered. Crenshaw nodded. "Yes, Garcia, a stairwell." "So we're not the first," Howard sighed. "All of that effort to find a long-lost remnant of our ancestors," Dr. Crenshaw finished, taking a tentative step onto the stone slide. "That doesn't seem like a good idea," I said. "We have no idea how old it might be." "It's more than a primitive staircase," the leader announced, bouncing his boot soles on the sturdy slope. "It feels sturdy. Just imagine the advanced craftsmanship necessary to construct something like this, Smithson. Those ancient hands could have merely carved a tunnel into the cave's wall, but the attached stones joined them together to form an intricate ramp. Imagine what marvels might lie below." Howard and Rachel followed their leader into the entrance, but I frowned and firmly stood my ground. It doesn't feel right. What kind of prehistoric civilization would have been able to achieve this? None of my team members answered, and I realized as they kept walking that I would either have to follow or be left alone, left in a forest which did not fill me with as much wonder as I had expected. I chose to follow. I hurried to catch up to my colleagues, hardly noticing that they had stopped walking, had stopped to stare in awe at the wall. "Careful," I laughed, echoing Rachel's earlier caution as I nearly bumped into her. "There's no handrail up here." She pointed at the wall. "Look at this, Steph." I followed the light of Crenshaw's torch to several lines of markings on the cave wall. The four of us moved closer to the symbols, with incremental waddles, as there was little room on the 3 feet wide slope. But moving nearer did nothing to answer burning questions. The marks, falling somewhere between drawings and hieroglyphs, became less discernible the closer I looked. It was as if the shapes were shifting, endlessly restructuring. I told myself, of course, that it's just a trick of the light. I felt silly, as I'd explored countless cave systems across the planet, and I'd never been afraid of the dark before, never been afraid of the unexplained. But there was a secret in that place I knew we weren't meant to learn. Something in my mind, or perhaps my very body, rejected the cave, reacted violently, screeching at me to drag the four of us out of there. Some small part of me, however, wouldn't cooperate. "You're the expert," Howard said to Crenshaw. "What is this?" "It's beautiful," the leader answered in a faint whisper. There was a detached expression on his face, an absent, unwilling nature to the way in which he raised a shaky hand towards the wall. Crenshaw was always detached, of course, but never like this. He was always lost in thought, but there no longer seemed to be anything behind the man's teary eyes. "Get a hold of yourself," I berated myself. "This is once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for your career. Do not fumble it." "We should record this," Rachel timidly suggested, as our leader brushed his fingertips against the etchings. "Dr. Crenshaw, I don't think we should do that. We wouldn't want to damage it." "Damage it?" Howard asked before laughing. "It's a stone etching that's lasted for millennia. It'll survive the human touch." He didn't feel it, but Rachel did. I did. "Dr. Crenshaw," I started. Then came a sharp cry of pain from our fearless leader's mouth, and the rest of us jolted in shock. We steadied ourselves quickly, thankfully, managing not to plummet over the side of the slope, and Crenshaw's hand retracted, whipped backwards with what sounded like the crack of bones, except the awful noise came from the wall itself. "Crenshaw," Howard cried, "are you okay?" "Yes," the man murmured. He lifted his index finger into the light of his torch, revealing a thin trickle of red spilling down the back of his hand. "How did you do that?" Howard asked. "Did you cut it on something?" I started to take off my rucksack. "I've got the first aid kit." Dr. Crenshaw shook his head and shone the torch beam onto the wall again. "That won't be necessary." Only I seemed to see it, as the man quickly drew his torch away, but my photographic memory always serves me well. There had, undoubtedly, been a difference in the drawing. One of the shapes had vanished. The squiggles or glyphs meant nothing to me, but I could see each of them clearly in my mind. There had been, amongst the rows of etchings, a trapezium bearing 2 small dots within. It was missing from the end of the final line, from the spot on the wall that I was certain Crenshaw had touched with his outstretched forefinger, but I have no idea why I didn't tell the others that. No idea why I let them continue to follow the slope down into the cave. No idea, most importantly, why I followed. Things were off-center in that place. We were off-center. My eyes scanned the walls erratically as we descended deeper and deeper. The lack of any further etchings only made me fear that they had been there, but vanished. Then my skin started to itch, and it was only adrenaline that stopped me from scratching. Half an hour later we reached it, the end of the stairwell, the floor of the cave, and once he'd stepped off the stone slope, Dr. Crenshaw turned to cast his light onto the team. Everybody was uncharacteristically quiet, and I didn't like it. I didn't like that. As we followed the sloping staircase, I'd noticed Howard and Rachel scratching at their skin too. Red, nail-carved streaks marked their napes. "I need to stop," Rachel mumbled, swaying on her feet. In response to her request, strangely, Dr. Crenshaw faced away from us. He swung his torch to face the large black tunnel ahead. The true cave. "By my estimations, this tunnel can only be, at most, 30 acres long," the leader grumbled. "At a brisk pace, we could reach the end in half an hour. We must soldier onwards, Garcia." I crossed the cave's floor over to Rachel, her shuddering form barely visible with Crenshaw's torch facing the other way. The man was just standing still, staring into the dark mouth of the cave. Its real mouth, not the stairwell we'd followed. By the time I reached my colleague, she had turned pale. Even in the scarce light, that much was clear. Her rows of teeth were knocking against one another, and when I placed the back of my hand against her brow, her skin iced mine, left me with the hot sting of touching something below freezing. Of course, that seemed impossible, given the cave's stifling temperature. I was sweating. I didn't understand how Rachel could be cold. "Dr. Crenshaw," I barked as our leader eyeballed the black abyss ahead. "We need to get Rachel out of here now. She requires medical attention." "Aren't you a woman of medicine?" Crenshaw muttered quietly. I clenched my fists. "I'm a biologist, Dr. Crenshaw, you know that, but I don't know what's happening to her." Rachel was starting to squat and shrink into herself, so I guided her down to the ground. "Cold," she whimpered as I started to take off my rucksack. Inside, I found my spare coat and a jumper. Then I knelt down and proceeded to wrap my colleague in both. Howard, meanwhile, strolled towards Crenshaw with a huff and snatched the torch of his hand. The leader did not protest. He continued to stare directly ahead whilst Howard walked over to us. Then the man handed the torch to me. "Could have done with an extra light whilst we were walking down the death slope," I said. "I wanted both of my hands free," Howard said, before offering a weak smile. "Not my fault you always forget the most basic things." I sighed, then said, "Sorry, I didn't mean to snap. This is just—" "I know," Howard interrupted, kneeling beside me to inspect our frozen colleague. "What's happening, Rachel? Talk to us." "My stomach," she whispered, clutching her abdomen with unsteady fingers. "It's burning." "Burning?" I asked, frowning. "You're cold to the touch." "I feel—" Rachel began, trailing off. Howard reached towards her stomach, then stopped. "We're going to need to take a look. Is that okay?" Rachel nodded, so our fellow researcher proceeded to peel back the bottom of her shirt. But his hand near immediately let it drop, and I tensed in disbelief. I had expected swollen skin, maybe a bruise, a cut, or something that would explain what was happening to Rachel, something within the realm of science. What I had not expected was to see Rachel's ribcage, to see a hole in her flesh. Howard and I finally let loose a joined screech as we saw the hole in our friend's stomach start to enlarge. Skin, around the opening's edge, was vanishing into thin air, as if it were being consumed by invisible teeth. The ribcage itself bore growing gaps from the invisible nightmare gnawing away at Rachel from the inside. And behind that disappearing skeleton, there were no innards, not even desecrated innards. In the emptiest of Rachel's skin outfit, there were crystals. Bulky, blue crystals stained with a smattering of reddish-brown. Howard threw up so instantaneously that he didn't manage to turn away, and a thick stream of vomit filled our friend's body. This revolting sight, of course, sparked a round of projectile expulsion from my own crying lips. Once Howard and I had finished, I moved the torch beam up her body so we wouldn't have to look at the awful, widening opening any longer. Rachel's face, completely devoid of color, looked back at me. Her eyes were harrowing, full of pain, but not quite pleading for an end, as she seemed unaware of what was happening to her. Thankfully, she was too weak to look down. There came the sound of Crenshaw's footsteps disappearing into the black tunnel. He was exploring without any light at hand, seemingly tiring of waiting, and I looked up for a moment, stared into the blackness, eyes tracking the sound of his fading steps. Now, with no more adrenaline coursing through my veins, I am aware that I felt something at the very far end of the tunnel, something large, still and malevolent, something watching, something in spite of its great size naked to the human eye. "What's wrong?" Rachel whined, her skin's shade transitioning from white to blue. "Nothing," I lied quietly. "How the fuck are you still alive?" Howard yelled, sending himself into a splutter of coughs. "Stop it, Howard," I begged, before turning back to her. "You're okay, Rachel. Everything's going to be okay." "There are so many of them," she whispered, eyes beginning to roll into the back of her head. I shivered. "So many of what?" My colleague smiled as a trickle of watery liquid squeezed out of her tightly closed mouth. Not blood, as she seemed to have nothing left inside. It wasn't really a smile. Of course, the muscles moved her lips into the right position, but it was muscle memory. She wasn't happy in that moment. She wasn't even Rachel anymore. Whatever grinned at us, it lifted a finger and tapped the blue, lifeless temple of my colleague. "They're up there," she giggled, tapping repeatedly. "Upstairs, chattering to each other. I hear them. Even now they're still so—" And then Rachel, or whatever remained of her, extinguished. I wailed in horror and sorrow, though the knot in my chest had admittedly loosened. To see Rachel's torment end was a blessing. "Famished," Dr. Crenshaw said, completing the lifeless woman's unfinished sentence. Without a moment's hesitation, I shot the torch upwards and looked away from Rachel's corpse. The expedition leader had not vanished into the blackness of the cave. Or, if he had, he'd somehow silently returned to his original standing position at its mouth. His back, once more, was turned to us, and he eyeballed the empty tunnel ahead. Dr. Crenshaw was not the same as he had been, however, which drew more horrified yelps from Howard and me. The back of our leader's head was missing. His skin bore an open wound which seemed to be growing wider and wider as something unseen munched away. "They're up there," Rachel had said. Howard and I no longer wanted answers. We rose to our feet and crept backwards, reversing towards the slope. "We're going to get help," Howard feebly promised, as we both started to turn, preparing to hastily ascend to safety. I kept my torch beam on the floor below, illuminating Dr. Crenshaw, who still refused to turn and face us. But as Howard and I followed the spiraling staircase upwards, the side of our leader's body came into view. The side of his face. Once we were near directly above the frozen, mutilated man, Howard clutched tightly to my shaking body, and I leaned over the edge of the slope, casting the torch downwards. "Please stay there," I weakly requested, eyeballing the statue beneath our feet. Terrifyingly, I did not feel fear for Dr. Crenshaw, but for my fleeing colleague and me, a feeling justified by the project leader's head snapping backwards. I nearly slipped over the edge, saved only by Howard's firm grip, as Crenshaw's face cranked upwards, only there was no face left at all. "They are too small to be seen," the man whispered without a mouth, without vocal cords. "We enter their home, and they enter ours." Dr. Crenshaw's eyes, glazed and aimless like those we'd seen on Rachel, sat above a stretching opening in his face. What had once been his face. His mouth and nose had been consumed by that unstoppable, unseen mass. Then, when the wound eventually swallowed his eyeballs, Howard and I watched each of those tearful spheres turn into red and white mist swallowed like everything else by thin air. Only holes remained, cutting a tunnel from the front to the back of Crenshaw's head. The beam of my torch bored straight through to the other side for a drawn-out second. Then the man's body crumpled into a lifeless, near-skinless mound, much like Rachel. The two corpses would, in little time at all, become nothing more than mounds of bloody clothes. Then came skittering from the cave's bowels, a cacophony of overlapping skittering noises, which sounded to me like an untold number of feet, tiny, moving, relatively to their mass, at an unfathomable speed. Howard and I saw nothing of the sort, of course. They are too small to be seen. But the cave floor, 10 feet under our watching point on the staircase, started to darken, as if some massive enormity were approaching, battalions of things only visible once they had collected in immeasurable numbers. Scientific curiosity did not get the best of us. We did not wait to see the unknown things up close. Howard and I rushed up the spiral staircase, rushed at such speed that we nearly tripped over the sides, falling to our deaths. We ran until we were winded, then we kept running, even as the skittering started to sound along the walls, pursuing us towards the stairwell's exit. But they did not follow us out of the top, did not follow us into the rainforest. We made it. We had collapsed, lungs deflated and bodies crying in pain, but we made it. That was why it took me a few minutes to notice what was out of place. I was still processing all that had happened. Howard wasn't breathing. I crawled over to his body, barely able to speak, and sobbed when I found him in the mud. I don't know how he managed to run up the staircase. There was nothing left of him in the dirt but bones and a few remaining strips of skin on his skull. Tears soaking my skin, I unclipped Howard's rucksack from the back of his half-body, and the man haunted me one final time by twisting onto his back, twisting to face me. I didn't move him. He moved himself, moved of his own accord. The rest is little more than blurry blotches in my memory, a blur of physical and mental anguish. I'm amazed that I'm here to tell this tale at all. That, in my state, I succeeded in scaling down the Inselberg's vertical side, that I made it to the airport, flew back to Paris, and collapsed in my bed. Precisely 90 hours and 100 missed calls later, the adrenaline seems to have evacuated my system. It was only tonight that I found myself gripped by a fresh horror. I woke in the middle of the night to the return of that unfixable itch. It was barely a tickle in the cave. Now I'm burning alive, but I'm so cold. I keep scratching, and with every fresh scratch, clumps of skin come away. Wounds form and they grow on their own. I am being consumed from the inside out, eaten by things too small to see. I don't know how those things escaped, but they did. Don't know how I survived so long whilst the others perished so quickly, how I made it down the mountain onto a plane and back to France. Except I do know. I know because I hear the chattering voices in my head, the voices which serve that thing back in the cave, the thing which watched me from the dark. They did not kill me quickly because they wanted me to make it back to the world of mankind, wanted me to transport them out of their cave. They needed a host, and now they are the explorers, discovering our world, our home, a place that, for whatever reason, they weren't able to reach until I entered their den and carried them free. We enter their home and they enter ours. If I'd known, I would have remained in that isolated sky forest to die, but it's too late. You see, I noticed it on the plane, but I thought I'd lost my mind, thought I'd simply been affected by the trauma of what I experienced at the bottom of the stairwell, but I wasn't imagining things. The passengers started scratching their flesh. By the end of the flight, every last person on that flight was clawing irritably at their skin. It's out in the world now. You're not safe. Nobody's safe because they're too small to see, too small and too quick. Forgive us for what we did. I'm sorry. You might think I'm stupid for posting this, admitting to a crime, and yeah, you're probably right. But I don't care anymore. The person I used to be, the guy who broke into a stranger's home for thrills and a quick payday, he's long gone. My name doesn't matter. You can call me whatever you want. Let's just say this is your anonymous warning. This all started 3 years ago, back when I was still pulling small-time jobs, mostly houses in affluent neighborhoods. I wasn't a mastermind or anything, just someone with sticky fingers and a knack for finding ways inside. When I heard about the abandoned Greystone mansion, I thought it was the perfect score. The place had been sitting empty for decades, and rumors swirled about treasures left behind by the original owners. Of course, there were also stories about why no one stayed in the mansion for long. Ghosts, curses, people vanishing without a trace, your usual small-town nonsense. But I figured those stories kept the amateurs out, leaving more for me. I drove out one moonless night with a flashlight, a crowbar, and a backpack, ready to haul away anything that looked remotely valuable. The mansion sat in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by overgrown trees and weeds as tall as me. The windows were mostly shattered, and ivy climbed its walls like nature was trying to reclaim the place. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew, and every step I took on the creaking floorboards echoed through the silence. I hit the usual spots first: drawers, cabinets, anything that might hold old jewelry or forgotten cash. Found nothing but dust and rats. Still, I wasn't ready to give up. The mansion was huge, with more rooms than I could count. There had to be something worth taking. That's when I saw the portraits. They lined the walls of a long hallway on the second floor, each one larger than life and painted with unnerving detail. At first, I thought they were just your typical old money portraits, stuffy men in suits, stern-looking women in elegant dresses, but the longer I looked, the more they unsettled me. The faces weren't just detailed, they were too lifelike. The paint seemed to glisten in the faint light of my flashlight, and the eyes... God, the eyes. They followed me wherever I went, their gazes drilling into my back even when I wasn't looking at them directly. But that wasn't what stopped me in my tracks. No, what froze me to the spot was the last portrait in the hallway. It was blank. At first I thought it was just an empty frame, but when I stepped closer, I saw faint outlines, shapes that seemed to shift and twist the longer I stared, and at the bottom of the frame, there was a small brass plaque with a single word etched into it, unfinished. A cold dread started creeping over me, but I shook it off. This was just a painting, I told myself. A creepy one, sure, but just a painting. I turned to leave the hallway, but something caught my eye. A small, leather-bound book sitting on a pedestal near the blank portrait. Curiosity got the better of me. The book looked ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle. The text was handwritten in a language I didn't recognize, though some of it looked like Latin. Near the back of the book was a crude drawing of the hallway I was standing in, complete with the portraits and a set of instructions. The words were written in shaky English. Stand before the unfinished. Speak the names of the chosen. Do not falter. I should have left right then and there, tossed the book, bolted down the stairs, and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I flipped back through the book, scanning the faded text for any mention of these chosen. There they were, names, dozens of them, written in a tight, slanted script. They were eerily familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd heard them before. Then, almost without thinking, I found myself standing in front of the blank portrait, the book open in my hands. As I stared at the empty canvas, my flashlight flickered and died, plunging the hallway into darkness. The silence pressed in on me like a weight, and for a moment I considered running, but something held me there, a morbid curiosity maybe, or sheer stupidity. I whispered the first name on the list. Nothing happened. Then the second name. Still nothing. But as I spoke the third, I heard it, a faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the walls. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as the sound grew louder, circling me, closing in. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. My heart pounded as I flipped through the book, trying to figure out what I'd unleashed. That's when I felt it, a presence behind me, so close I could feel its breath on my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the portraits, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. No, not just the portraits. They were moving. The figures inside the frames shifted and writhed, their painted expressions twisting into something unrecognizable. Their eyes burned with a malevolent light, and one by one, they began to step out of their frames. Panic surged through me as I dropped the book and ran. The sound of footsteps, no, many footsteps, chasing me down the hallway. I didn't stop until I was out of the mansion, my chest heaving and my hands trembling. I never went back for the book, and I've spent every day since trying to convince myself it was all just a bad dream. But I know the truth. The eyes in those portraits weren't just paintings. They were people, real people, trapped in those frames, waiting for someone stupid enough to set them free. And the worst part, when I got back to my car, I caught my reflection in the window. For just a split second, my face didn't look like my own. It looked like a painting. I didn't go back to the mansion right away. For weeks I kept telling myself to move on, to forget, but ignoring what happened wasn't as easy as I thought it would be. It started small. At first I'd feel like someone was standing behind me when I was alone, just a faint pressure, like the air shifting. I told myself it was paranoia, the fallout of a bad break-in that shook me up. Then things got worse. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. I began to notice people watching me, or at least I thought they were. A guy sitting across from me on the bus would stare until I turned to meet his eyes. Then he'd suddenly glance away, like nothing had happened. In line at the coffee shop, a woman behind me would shift uncomfortably, her head angled slightly in my direction. When I turned, she'd be looking at the menu, her face calm and unreadable. At first I chalked it up to coincidence. The mind plays tricks when you're on edge, right? But it kept happening. It wasn't just random strangers either. It was everyone. Even people I knew. Friends, acquaintances, the guy at the bodega who rang me up every morning, they all started to do it. I'd catch them looking at me from the corner of my eye, their expressions blank, neutral. But when I turned my head, they'd act like nothing had happened. And then there were the smiles. Not big ones, not obvious, just the faintest curl of their lips, like they were sharing some private joke I wasn't in on. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed I couldn't unsee it. They all looked like they knew something. By the end of the second month, I'd stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd picture the hallway in the mansion, the way the portraits had moved, their hollow faces and grasping hands. I knew it wasn't over. Whatever I'd set free, it was still with me. I finally broke one night after a particularly bad encounter. I was walking home from the grocery store, arms weighed down by bags, when I passed an old man sitting on a bench. He wasn't doing anything, just sitting there, staring straight ahead. As I passed, I glanced at him, and his head turned to follow me. It wasn't a normal movement. It was too smooth, too precise, like the way the portraits had moved. I stopped dead in my tracks, the plastic bags digging into my hands. The old man didn't blink. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but my voice cracked on the last word. He didn't answer. He just smiled. Not a warm smile, not a kind one, just that faint, knowing curl of his lips. I staggered, the bag slipping from my grip as a few cans clattered to the ground. I didn't stop to pick them up. I just left them behind and ran the rest of the way home. The next morning, I packed my things. I couldn't explain it, but I knew staying in the city wasn't safe anymore. Maybe it was paranoia, but I didn't care. I moved to a new town, rented a cheap room in a rundown motel, and tried to start over. For a while it worked. The people here were friendly but distant. I kept my head down, took odd jobs to pay the bills, and avoided unnecessary conversations. For the first time in months, I felt almost normal again. But it didn't last. One day I was fixing a fence for a farmer on the edge of town when I felt it again, that prickle on the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched. I glanced up, and there was a woman standing at the edge of the field, half hidden by the tall grass. She wasn't moving. Her face was partially obscured, but I could tell she was staring right at me. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. She just turned and walked away, vanishing into the grass without a sound. That night I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands. The scar on my palm from the night I shattered the display case in an antique shop had healed into a thin white line, but it still throbbed whenever I thought about the mansion. I realized then that running wasn't going to help. Whatever this was, it wasn't tied to a place, it was tied to me. I guess something in me snapped that night. Maybe it was desperation. Or maybe I thought destroying the mansion would sever the connection. I didn't plan it, I just acted. I grabbed a can of gasoline from the shed behind my motel and drove back to Greystone in the dead of night. The mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette even darker against the moonless sky. The air was heavy, suffocating as I stepped inside. The portraits were waiting, their painted eyes alive with something far worse than malice. I couldn't bring myself to look too closely, afraid I'd see them move again. Their gazes followed me down the hall as I worked, splashing gasoline on the walls, the floors, and the ornate frames that held those cursed faces. When I reached for the matchbox, my hands were trembling so badly that I dropped it. It hit the floor with a clatter, spilling matches in every direction. My heart nearly stopped as I watched the tiny sticks scatter across the soaked floorboards, a few skittering dangerously close to the gasoline. I cursed under my breath, trying to keep my cool and avoid stepping on the gasoline, because that would be a really bad idea. Crouching low, I grabbed the nearest match that hadn't been doused. My fingers fumbled as the oppressive silence seemed to press in, my heart beat loud in my ears. With shaking hands I struck it. The flames sputtered to life, impossibly bright in the darkness. Without a second thought, I tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked floor and scrambled back as the fire erupted in a wave of heat and light. The fire roared to life, devouring everything in its path. The portraits twisted and warped in the heat, their colors bleeding and melting into one another. For a moment I thought I heard them screaming. I didn't stick around to find out. I ran in a panic, the flames roaring at my heels as I sprinted toward the door. When I finally stumbled outside, the mansion was engulfed, its windows glowing like fiery eyes piercing the night. I stood there, gasping for breath, watching as the inferno devoured everything. I went home to my apartment believing it was over, that I'd destroyed whatever evil had taken hold of that place. I couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning I went back to Greystone, or at least what was left of it. The fire I'd set had gutted the mansion completely, leaving behind little more than a pile of ash and charred stone. The front steps still stood, blackened but intact, leading up to nothing but sky. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ruins, trying to figure out what to do. Then I saw it. Amid the rubble, something caught the light, a glint of metal. I climbed over the crumbling remains of the doorway and picked my way through the wreckage. When I reached the spot where the hallway had been, I found it, a brass plaque, scorched but still legible. Unfinished. My stomach turned. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to risk taking anything from this place ever again. But as I stood there, staring at the plaque, I felt something shift. The air grew heavy, the way it does before a thunderstorm. And then I heard it. Faint at first, almost a whisper, but growing louder with every second. Footsteps. They were coming closer. The footsteps echoed through the ruins of the mansion, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought they might belong to another unlucky thrill-seeker who had wandered into the wreckage, but something about them felt wrong. They didn't shuffle over broken debris or falter on the unstable ground. They were steady, rhythmic, like they belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. Backing away from the plaque, I turned and scrambled over the rubble, ignoring the sharp edges scraping my hands and legs. I didn't stop until I was outside, the morning sun barely cutting through the overcast sky. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were still coming, their sound impossibly clear, even though no one emerged from the wreckage. I stared at the empty doorway, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for something to appear. Then I saw them. Not in the doorway, but in the distance, figures standing along the edge of the property. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, scattered among the overgrown grass and skeletal trees. At first I thought they were strangers, maybe people from the nearby town curious about the mansion. But they weren't moving. They just stood there, watching me. Even though they were too far away for me to make out their faces, I knew they were staring. That same weight I'd felt for weeks was back, heavier than ever, pressing down on me like a vice. I took a step back, and one of the figures shifted. Its head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging my movement. Another step, and the others started to move too, not toward me, but around me, circling the ruins in perfect synchronization. I don't remember running to my car. One moment I was standing there frozen, and the next, I was behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The drive back to town was a blur. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The road was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. By the time I reached the motel, my head was pounding, and my legs felt like jelly. I locked the door behind me, shoved a chair under the handle, and collapsed onto the bed. But the feeling didn't go away. I could sense them, standing just beyond the edge of my awareness, like shadows lingering in the corner of my eye. Every sound, every creak of the old building made me jump, my mind conjuring images of the figures standing outside my window, waiting for me to look. That night, the first knock came. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, the TV on low to drown out the silence, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the door. 3 slow raps, evenly spaced. I froze, staring at the door. Then I remembered. The motel had no front desk, no housekeepers, and no reason for anyone to bother me at this hour. Another knock, louder this time. I grabbed the crowbar I'd brought back from Greystone and approached the door, my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. The third knock rattled the doorframe and I almost dropped the crowbar. I leaned in, peering through the peephole. The hallway outside was empty, but I knew better than to trust what I saw. I stepped back, gripping the crowbar tighter, and the knock came again, this time from the window. Spinning around, I saw nothing but the drawn curtains, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. For what felt like hours, the room was silent. Then I heard it. The faint creak of floorboards, not outside, but inside the room. I turned, swinging the crowbar wildly, but there was no one there. The room was empty, exactly as I'd left it, but the sound of footsteps didn't stop. They circled me, moving just beyond the edges of the light. And then the whispers started. Faint and indistinct, like voices carried on a breeze. I couldn't make out the words, but I didn't need to. I knew what they wanted. The figures, the portraits, the unfinished. They weren't gone. They'd followed me, clinging to my very existence like a curse. And now they were done lurking. The whispers swelled, overlapping until they merged into a single deafening roar. Pain shot through my skull as if it were splitting open, and I dropped the crowbar, clutching my ears in agony. "Stop!" I screamed, but the voices only grew louder. In the haze of noise and pain, I saw them, shapes materializing in the corners of the room, their faces smooth and featureless. They didn't move like people. They glided, their limbs bending unnaturally as they closed in. I stumbled, my foot catching on loose rubble and throwing me off balance. My hand shot out instinctively, reaching for the crowbar, but instead, it closed around something cold and metallic. The plaque. It shouldn't have been there. I left it at the mansion, I was sure of it, but there it was, sitting on the motel desk, as if it had always been there. The figures stopped, their blank faces turning toward the plaque in unison. I had no idea what I was doing, but I grabbed it anyway, clutching it like a shield. Is this what you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling as the words stumbled out. The figures froze, their heads tilting as if considering the question. Then, one by one, they began to retreat, fading into the shadows until the room was empty again. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stared at the plaque, the word unfinished gleaming faintly in the dim light. Deep down, I understood. This wasn't the end. It was the start of something far worse. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every sound, every flicker of a shadow felt like one of those figures returning, lurking just out of sight in the corners of my room. By dawn, I came to a grim conclusion. I couldn't keep running. Whatever this was, it wouldn't stop until I faced it. The plaque sat on the motel desk, its brass surface tarnished and dull, but the word etched into it, unfinished, seemed to pulse faintly, like it was alive. I didn't know what it wanted me to do, but I had a feeling the mansion held the answers, or what was left of it. I returned to Greystone as the sun rose higher, the ruins almost peaceful under the light. But the calm was deceptive. The air still carried that oppressive weight, like the place itself was watching me. I walked through the rubble, my boots crunching on charred wood and shattered stone, until I reached the heart of the mansion. The plaque seemed to grow heavier in my hand the closer I got, like it was pulling me towards something. And then I saw it, a trapdoor, partially obscured by debris. I don't know how I'd missed it before. It looked old, the wood scorched but still intact, with a rusted iron handle. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave, but I couldn't ignore the pull of the plaque. I knelt and yanked the trapdoor open. Beneath it was a set of stone stairs spiraling into darkness. The air grew colder as I descended, the faint smell of ash giving way to something earthier, damp soil, rotting wood. My flashlight barely pierced the gloom, but the stairs went on, deeper than should have been possible. Finally, I reached the bottom. The room was small, the walls carved directly into the stone, and at its center was a pedestal. On it rested an object covered in a dark, tattered cloth. I approached slowly, the plaque in my hand vibrating slightly, as if urging me forward. With a deep breath, I reached out and pulled the cloth away. Underneath was another painting. It was just like the others, the frame ornate and gilded, the canvas impossibly detailed. But this one wasn't of a person. It was of a scene. A field, overgrown and wild, with a single figure standing in the distance. It looked familiar, but I couldn't place why, until I realized the perspective was mine. The painting showed me, standing where I'd been earlier that morning, staring back at the mansion. As I stared at the painting, the figure in it began to move, turning slowly to face me. Its features were blurred, distorted, but its posture was unmistakable. It wasn't just watching me, it was mimicking me. And then it smiled. The walls of the room trembled, dust raining from the ceiling as the figure in the painting stepped closer. My flashlight flickered, and the air grew thick, almost liquid, making it harder to breathe. I staggered back, clutching the plaque like a lifeline. The figure reached the edge of the canvas, its distorted features pressing against the surface as if trying to break free. I didn't think, I just acted. Raising the plaque, I slammed it into the painting with all my strength. The canvas tore with a sound like a scream, the edges curling and blackening as the room erupted into chaos. The walls cracked, the floor buckled, and the pedestal crumbled into dust. A deafening roar filled the air as shadows poured from the painting, swirling around me like a storm. I ran, scrambling back up the stairs as the room collapsed behind me. The shadows clawed at my heels, their whispers deafening, but I didn't stop. I burst through the trapdoor just as the last of the staircase crumbled into darkness. When I reached the surface, the ruins were still. The oppressive weight that had hung over the mansion was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. The plaque was gone too, along with the shadows. For the first time in months, I felt free. That was 3 years ago. I've tried to move on, to live a normal life, but there's always a part of me that wonders. The mansion's ruins were cleared a few months after I left, the land sold to a developer. They built a row of luxury homes there, all sleek glass and polished stone. I read about it in the paper, saw photos of smiling families posing in front of their new homes. But I can't help wondering if they feel it too, that faint pressure, that sense of being watched. I've stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped jumping at shadows, but sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in a room, I'll catch the faintest sound. Footsteps. Not close, no, but they're there. They're always there.